As I said in my introduction, we can always count on Darren to tell the truth. Thank you. Thank you. So, in this moment of question and answer and the real possibility here to hear some more from you as we all look for a way to understand the moment and all the issues that are speaking to us, we have some questions from the audience, and thank you to those who submitted them. So our first question is from Anne Marie Miller with Art Pride, New Jersey. And she asks, since a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts requires a minimum of a 1-to-1 match with a private or other contributions, and the Ford Foundation has served many times as grantees' private match, what does it signal to the Ford Foundation when one of your grantees demonstrates that they have successfully won an NEA grant already, and why is it important for nonprofit arts organizations to have a mix of public and private funds?
Well, I think that's a great question, and it does signal something very important to us when we have an applicant who's already received an NEA grant and is seeking a match, because the process through which the NEA and NEH review is a very rigorous process. There are usually a series of panels. There are usually double and triple tiers of vetting. So by the time it reaches us, we have some assurance of credibility, of effectiveness as an organization. So it matters a lot to us when we see an applicant who has received an NEA or NEH grant.
Great, thank you. Next, we have a question from Brad Erickson of Theater Bay Area and Californians for the Arts. Knowing that the Ford Foundation is an international foundation that has a presence in many countries, including some with national ministries of culture, what are the pros and cons of a cultural ministry system compared to the US's, and how would you advise that we at least have a cabinet-level advisor within the White House?
I would absolutely advise that. I find it really curious that those who oppose this idea use an argument of sort of pluralism, that in some way American art is so heterogeneous that it's difficult to imagine what a perspective would be. So for example, when you look at the French, who do have a minister of culture and a huge ministry, as you know, quite frankly, the French culture is far more homogenous than our culture. I mean, I love French culture, but it's rather one-dimensional. I mean, I think it's interesting, but it's, seriously, I mean, when you think about American culture, if I compare other parts of the world where, I mean, what is so unique and something we should be amplifying through that level of government service, it is the uniqueness of our culture, and therefore the kind of pride that should come from projecting that out to the world and across the country. I find it really odd.
All right. And now we have a question from George Zugros of the Wisconsin Arts Board, who asks, what response could you share with us when elected officials claim the amount of federal or state investment in the arts is so small that private sector foundations can make up the difference? You spoke to this, but go further.
I spoke to it a little bit, but I find that's another thing I find interesting from opponents, right? I mean, I think what's interesting is that the very people who will be harmed the most are not those of us who live in places like New York or Washington. We rely on the NEA and NEH for support in New York institutions. But there are many places where private philanthropy really doesn't even exist in this country. And the role of support from the two endowments is essential to the livelihoods of some of these institutions. And so when people say, oh, it's a small amount and can't we just zero it out? It really is almost counterintuitive, and it's illogical, because if what we hear often is leverage, and that government dollars should be leveraged. There is no better example in the entire federal budget of private dollars being leveraged more than the endowments. And so, so when people who are private sector oriented make that argument, again, I find it really illogical and unprincipled. I mean, I could understand it if the logic flowed and you could say, okay, there's a principle here and I understand your principle. But the logic doesn't even flow.
Now let's talk a little bit about your work at this moment. How is art essential to the Ford Foundation's mission to promote social justice here in America and throughout the world?
Well, I think it's critical because part of the arts and the humanities is storytelling, for example. We know the power of storytelling. We know that stories often matter more than facts, and that narratives are very powerful to the American psyche. We have narratives about who we are as a people. And from a social justice perspective, we need storytelling. We need the arts. So when you see something like we just witnessed with Anna, who was giving us the story of this incarcerated woman who was there because of her association with the man that landed her in prison for 25 years. Those stories are powerful. When you have artists who use their art form to challenge us, when you see the photographs of Carrie Mae Weems, or you see the work of Shirin Nashat, and you think about the Middle East, I mean, there are just ways in which we need desperately the arts, because artists have always been the canaries in the coal mine. Artists have always been willing to take risks and be courageous. When you think about all of the social progress in America in the 20th century, artists were on the front lines of each and every one of those social changes. And so it's hard to imagine American progress and social justice without artists.
So it seems... So it seems then, I'm going to combine my last two questions because in many ways you've just spoken to this incredible role artists have and to the role of how art can transform us, right? We all can speak to, in many ways in our lives, right, that the arts have transformed. So speak in the moment we are now and talk about why art is important to our democracy at this very moment, and essentially, by extension, how art can change the world.
Well, I think, that's a big question, Thelma.
I know. Well, Darren?
So I really do believe that we need the arts because in this time, it is really true that we need healing in this country. We need bridges. We need bridge builders. And we need our leaders to exemplify these qualities. And often what happens is we can't always rely on our leaders. We have to rely on those things that give meaning in our lives. And for many of us, the arts and humanities gives us that meaning. It gives us a way of being purposeful and being hopeful, even in the wake of things that make us dejected and despondent. All you've got to do is spend an evening at New York City Ballet, or you spend an evening watching a great performance, or when you're in one of those really funky moods, to just walk through the galleries of a museum. So for me, I think we need the kinds of healing in our souls, in our hearts and our spirits that the arts can give us to help sustain us. And the institutions that we need to be resilient and fortified are those institutions of art and culture. So we all need to be doing everything that we can to support institutions like yours, because our democracy relies on resilient, durable institutions, because no matter what the circumstance, what the political flavor of the month is, those institutions endure. And so if you haven't done it already, make a contribution to your local arts institution.
Thank you. Friends, will you join me in saluting my favorite truth teller, bridge builder, visionary, advocate for all of us in the arts?